The photographic exposure plays a critical role in how we see our images. So far, I've got my sun angled in and the shadows soften, but I haven't really calibrated my camera at all. I'll press 8, and this pulls up my environment and effects dialog. Alternately, we can choose rendering and environment and exposure settings. The photographic exposure then gives us control over the image in two ways. We can either work by an exposure value or by a photographic exposure using the shutter speed, aperture or f-stop, and film speed or ISO. I'm going to switch over to the photographic exposure, and we have presets if we'd like, starting out with an outdoor daylight in a clear sky, or indoor daylight, for example. When we switch over, for example choosing indoor daylight, we get a different value in our lighting. We can see parts of the image almost blow out, and then we can pull them back if we need. When the daylight system starts out, it's calibrated for the sunny 16 rule, meaning that the aperture and ISO are the inverse of each other. What I'm going to do is increase the sensitivity of the film to light, bringing up the ISO to 200. A higher ISO means a greater sensitivity, and the image gets brighter. Then I'll take that shutter speed down. Right now it's at a 16th of a second, which is actually quite slow and will result in motion blur in an image. I'm going to run this at a shutter of a 48th of a second, which will darken down the image considerably. Then I'll open up the aperture. I'll try in here an f5.6 and see how this looks. I'll run another test render and see what the values are in here. At some point, we can exceed what the graphics card can show in the view, even in the realistic shading in the nitrous viewport. And so I'll make sure I render to test out how that exposure is looking. If you'd like, you can use the render preview, although it tends to be a little on the small side, and sometimes we need to see at least a half-size render of our scene. I can tell already that this is very bright, and I need to tone this back. One of the things you'll learn to do is to train your eye to read the final gather, seeing before you actually get the full rendering how the scene is looking. I don't want it to blow out, and so I'm going to reduce the shutter speed and stop down the image a bit so I get my darkness back. I'll hit escape, and in this case, I'm going to bring that shutter up to a 128th of a second and run an f6.4 in the aperture. This time what I'll also do is check geometry in the reuse section to reuse or cache the geometry. I'll hit render and I should get a darker image. If you're running a composite shot, you may have these values given to you for your background plate. Alternately, if you're running an all CG shot, your director of photography may choose how they're going to lens it. Then again, you may be on your own and have the option of simply setting it to look right. It's up to you how you want to view or see the scene. The trick is to blend the values so that you get good value without artificially brightening and good darkness without artificially darkening or crushing down the shadows. In this case, it's still too bright. What I'm going to do is bring that shutter speed up a little bit more so that my white wall and stairs aren't totally blown out. I'll hit escape one more time and try this at a 256th of a second. That sounds fast, but it's actually not as fast as we can go. And because my aperture is comparatively open, I need to bring that shutter down so I get a darker image. Typically what we'll see is that we'll use 100 or 200 speed inside, and 200 for dim exteriors and 400 or even 800 for bright exteriors. You can actually get tables both from camera manufacturers and, if you're actually using film manufacturers on where to use their film and suggested exposure values and exposure settings. This is looking better. My white stair treads are still fairly hot, but I can definitely perceive the detail on the top and the sides. My white wall is still bright in the back, but it's not blown out. I can still perceive some of the warmth in that color. I've got good sunbeams on that tile wall, and even the dark shadows are still receiving some light. They're not going totally dark. Also, we can tell even in this final gather pass that the underside of the bridge, that ceiling with the wood on it, is getting some light on it. That rich tone in the wood is coming across, and with a little bit of increase in the final gather bounce, we'll really get a luminous, soft scene.